Give yourselves a round of applause. Emerald City is sold out, and this is the most packed panel that we've had in the Secret Origins series. So. All right, so we'll get things started. Look, this guy doesn't really need an introduction. You know, everything from epic runs on The Punisher to Preacher, The Boys, you know, his new book, Red Team. We've got a lot to talk about today, so without any further ado, please welcome Garth Ennis.
There we go. That good?
Yeah. You guys okay on the audio? Right on. We've got the light to go. So first off, for everyone in the crowd, we're going to open it up to questions a little bit later. And if you have a cell phone, feel free to switch that off because so far every interview has been interrupted at least once by Guile's theme. So we're on a roll. Because the theme of this series is Secret Origins, the first question I've been asking everyone, and I know some of this is subject matter you've covered before, but the first piece of comics work you were paid to write?
That was a thing called Troubled Souls. It was drawn by John McCrae. It was serialized in a British anthology comic called Crisis, and it appeared in April of '89, I believe. It was later collected in a trade paperback. That would have been the first one.
How did you sort of open the door to getting that?
Crisis was spun out of another anthology title you may have heard of called 2000 AD. It's the British comic that Judge Dredd and various others came from. It was a move into sort of adult political comics that came out of the success of Dark Knight, of Watchmen, Mouse, and so on in the mid to late 80s. It was overtly political. When they launched it, they had a signing tour. The tour came to a number of British cities. It came to Belfast. I met some of the people, including the editor, Steve McManus. And I didn't so much pitch him the idea as just say, would you be at all interested in a story about the troubles, the political situation in Northern Ireland, which was ongoing at that time? He said yes. He probably thought no more about it. I sent the idea in, just a couple of pages typed up. In the meantime, Crisis had hit trouble. Its audience was nowhere near as big as 2000 AD's. They'd expected it to be, but it turned out the adult comics audience, however you want to define that, wasn't anywhere near as big as they thought. They decided they needed a change, and a change fast, and my story, I found out later, was just kind of the least appalling on the pile of submissions. I should explain that by saying that Crisis wasn't offering a particularly brilliant deal, and many of the British writers and artists had been kind of abused by 2000 AD for a long time and were on their way out to America. Many had already made the jump. So when it came time for the editorial team to find something to replace the story they were scrapping, they really did have to settle for what they could get. And in I went.
Well, 2000 AD was such a huge launching pad for so many creators. Yesterday, Simon Bisley was talking about his work with it. I'm curious, at the time, you know, comics can be so weirdly insular because, of course, you're creating on your own. Were you interacting with any of those other creators at that time? Was there a camaraderie, or were you very sort of separate?
Living in Northern Ireland, no. There really was, there was one guy called Will Simpson, who I later worked with on Hellblazer. There was John McCrae himself, who ran Northern Ireland's, well, Belfast's first comic store. There may have been some sort of fandom group or other arranged around Queen's University at Belfast. There probably was. I didn't know anything about it. We had pretty spotty distribution of comics, except the mainstream British titles. And so any of the American stuff and any of the more independent British comics like Warrior, which featured Miracle Man and V for Vendetta, passed me by. So really I was kind of on my own. I was aware that there was this, you know, thriving scene in mainland Britain. And in fact, I attended one comic convention a few months before I kind of broke into the industry, and I got to see a lot of the people I admired, but I had really no interaction with them before I kind of broke in myself.
And Judge Dredd, can you talk a little bit about coming onto that?
My own work on it I don't regard as very important. I don't think I did a good job. The reason being I was too much of a fan of the character. It hindered me from really coming up with any kind of ideas of my own, putting my own stamp on it. So whereas I'm able to come to something like The Punisher, a character who I have no kind of inherent love for because I didn't grow up with him, I can look at something like The Punisher and say, okay, I don't really care what's gone before. I'll just do my thing. I'll put my stamp on this and ignore everything that happened before. With Dredd, I was too much in awe of the old stuff, which was a part of my childhood. You know, I began reading Judge Dredd age 7, and was with the, I still read it to this day, actually. So long as the original series creator, John Wagner, is writing it, I'll read it. But I was too close to it. It was a huge deal at the time, but it very quickly turned sour for me. And I think it taught me a very important lesson, which is not to keep looking over your shoulder, keep looking ahead, create new stories, new characters. Don't look back. Don't repeat what's already been done, which I think is a big problem that comics have. Don't be the 489th guy to write Daredevil, the 987th guy to write Batman. You're probably not going to say much new. You're certainly not going to be the first Dark Knight or Year One. So my attitude is, do your own thing, keep moving forward. That's what the experience of Dredd taught me.
Absolutely. And then obviously you made the leap over to Vertigo. Can you talk about how that happened?
That was another case of being the least awful. Karen Berger, who was actually it was pre-Vertigo. Just thinking about it, it was a couple of years before Vertigo kicked off. But Jamie Delano was leaving Hellblazer. He'd had a very successful run. I actually think his was the kind of the original and best. At least on the book, I'm aware that Alan Moore created the character. He was leaving, they needed someone new. Everyone and their uncle submitted an outline. But again, the generation of British writers that might have been better at the book, at writing the book, Grant Morrison, Pete Milligan, Neil Gaiman, they were already engaged with their own thing. So it fell to the next generation, and that meant me, Mark Miller, and John Smith, and I guess mine was the least dog-eared, you know, the most ready for publication. But it got picked up. Karen actually did something quite clever there. She said she invited the proposals, and then because there was a lot of interest in the competition for the job, she then immediately appointed her new editor, Stuart Moore, to make the choice. So it was like, congratulations, the job's yours, and now for this tricky little bit of business here, it's all yours, Stuart. So I have Stuart Moore to thank for that one.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, after Hellblazer, with Preacher, that was sort of the first thing that, when you're talking about Judge Dredd, about looking over your shoulder, looking forward, was Preacher sort of the first thing that you did that you felt you were really, aside from the troubles, looking forward in that sort of Vertigo world?
I think it was the first point where everything really came together for me and crystallized, both in terms of what I wanted to write about and how I wanted to handle my career. One of the very first people I met once I did start to interact with people who were already in the industry was, to my great good fortune, Alan Moore. And he and a couple of the other British guys gave me some very good advice. They said, just own what you create. You use these companies, 2000 AD or DC or Marvel, and use them to establish a reputation, but don't ever think that ultimately they will look after you in the long run. You've got to look after yourself, and that means as many creator-owned properties as you possibly can. So that was why Preacher was important to me. In terms of the actual story, it did not come together in a particularly organic fashion. It started out, probably the starting point was the angel and demon thing, which if you think about it is very Vertigo, very Hellblazer,
Right.
very Sandman. the particularly American and indeed Texan aspects of it developed over the year or so that it took the story to come together. Cassidy, for instance, was actually originally Jesse was going to be a completely ordinary American guy from, could have been anywhere. Cassidy was going to be the specific Texan. And then it occurred to me, no, the hero has to be the Texan. And we'll make Cassidy, what will we make Cassidy? And then it was like, well, let's take a step back. I'll have an Irish character. But that's an example of what I'm talking about. The thing did not come fully formed. It came along in bits and pieces and scraps. It developed like that.
I'm curious, it's hard for people reading the work now to contextualize when Preacher first came out, but I'm curious what sort of reactions you got filtering in when the book first came out, and also if Vertigo ever was trepidatious about the way you were sort of, pushing the envelope. Obviously, characters like Arseface and stuff are really, really intense, and I'm curious if you ever had any pushback.
I was fortunate in that the editor, Stuart Moore, and the assistant editor, Julie Rottenberg, and then later the replacement editor, Axel Alonso, were always 100% behind the book. They got it. They understood why it was the way it was and why it had to be that way. And while it's not the kind of thing that Karen would necessarily gravitate towards herself, I think it's fairly obvious she would have preferred the Sandman end of Vertigo. She has the hallmark of a great editor, which is to publish things that you yourself necessarily aren't that into, but you understand that they're important for your line of comics to grow. So I never really had any serious trouble. I know that people above Karen's level weren't that crazy about it, but it had become its own. It had succeeded, and that was the bottom line for them.
Again, I sort of mentioned earlier comics being very, in a way, insular because you're writing on your own. You're going into, offices or sometimes doing phone calls. At what point did you realize that book had a very rabid fan base?
It launched reasonably well, and for the first 10 months, it did what most books usually do, which is to sort of dip gently, steadily. And then around about issue 10, we had a guy who, this would have been just about when, I suppose, message boards and fan participation on the internet was getting going. We had a guy who kicked up a huge fuss about how Preacher was just the filthiest thing he'd ever seen. The list of crimes that Preacher's guilty of. I won't bother to repeat them, but he listed them. It ignited a huge debate online, both about the merits of the book and the right of freedom of expression. Much of this I was ignorant of, but we then watched the sales start to climb, and pretty soon a lot of people within the industry were discovering it and helping to push it. I'd obviously point there to Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti. Once they discovered it and it was right up their street, they began to really spread the word. Generally, the thing just kind of exploded at that point. I'm not sure if it was this one chap who ignited the controversy, or if a lot of people simply became aware of it at that time, but it did us a lot of good, and from then on, we were pretty much safe. And the rest is history, really, because once they made the decision to put it into trade paperbacks, which was not the automatic guarantee that it is now, the thing was going to live on and develop a life of its own, and it's been that way ever since.
Now, you mentioned Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti. Obviously, one of the things that you're incredibly well known for is sort of reinvigorating and reinventing, in a way, the Punisher. Can you talk about how they sort of lured you into the Marvel universe? And I'm curious, in that initial pitch, how much did they say about wanting you to be able to push the envelope?
They made it clear that it wouldn't be a mature reader's book. It wouldn't be what I was used to. But they'd seen another Punisher book I'd done called The Punisher Kills the Marvel Universe, which was a sort of 48 pages of lunacy that I'd gotten away with a few years ago. And they said, if you can keep it about that, we'll be okay, and we'll keep the executives off your back. And that's what we did, really. The first series of The Punisher, which I did under the Marvel Knights banner, I always think has a sort of a Looney Tunes, Coyote and the Roadrunner aspect to it. I mean,
Right.
it's mad. The second series, the Max book, is more what I think of as my run on The Punisher, really. It actually came out of, I suppose it came out of the events and the aftermath of September the 11th. All of a sudden, violence in the world wasn't quite the wacky, funny subject that it had been. Not that I was going to stop writing silly violence books, but I wasn't going to do it in The Punisher anymore. I decided I wanted to write about why the world was like this and what it would really be like for a man to take on the mission that Frank Castle does. Again, it helped that without any particular worries about past incarnations of the Punisher, I really felt like I had a blank slate and I could do whatever I wanted, and the Max label helped with that too.
Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that at the time you took over and were doing the Marvel Knights Punisher, that series had effectively been sort of off. It had not been coming out for a bit, correct? I think
Yeah,
it had been dormant for a while.
I think there'd been something. I can't remember who did it, but there was a sort of undead Punisher angel story or something.
I do actually. I know what you're talking. I'm just trying to remember who wrote it. Someone out there probably does.
I think the Punisher had more or less been published on and off throughout that period, but they never managed to get it where they wanted it. The thing about the Punisher is that in the early 90s, it was one of those books that was a license to print money. I mean, you could put out an issue 1 of Punisher Warzone or Punisher 2099 and you'd make a mint. And Marvel loved it. And I think ever since then, they've kind of wondered why, some people at Marvel have wondered why they've never been able to get it back to that point. The X-Men, Spider-Man, you can still do that kind of thing. Yeah. Punisher, not so much. I sometimes wonder if it might be the reason for things like Frankencastle or Punisher in Space, these kind of things, because it's like, I'm sure there's a way to get the Punisher back up there in sales. Just not sure what it is. Let's keep going until we, and that's why they keep trying these ideas. I personally think, just do it right. It's very simple. He's one of the simplest characters to write and to get right in comics. Do that and you're fine. But I was just going to say, but you'll never get it back up to those early 90s numbers because those days are gone.
And I apologize because this is a little off your timeline, but I'm just curious, have you read any of the newer sort of Punisher stuff that Greg Rucka was doing, which was sort of definitely seemed to bring it back a little to the essence of the...
Yeah, I haven't read that one. I did read Jason Aaron's, which I was impressed by. I also read the 3 or 4 story arcs that followed my own run.
Okay.
And there was a very good one by Victor Gischler that I liked a lot. Nice. So, and I see they do occasionally do a Max Punisher book, so the spirit's still there.
When they approached you with the Max line, I think Alias was the first Max title, I believe. Were they sort of saying like, hey, this is not our Vertigo, but this is our No Holds Barred? Like, because the first issue of Alias, I think for anyone who hasn't read it, was it certainly separated itself from other Marvel fare because of I'm not going to go into too much detail because I don't know podcast-wise, but there is a sex act in it that I thought, well, I have not seen that in a Marvel book before. That is a surprise to see Luke Cage.
I didn't see that, but all I was told, and it was Axel Alonso, in fact, ex-Vertigo, who'd gone over to Marvel, who'd campaigned to get Max going. Right. And he just told me, look, it's no holds barred. You can do whatever you want. So I think the first thing I did actually was that Nick Fury book I did with Derek Robertson.
Okay.
And I can recall, I don't think I consciously pushed my luck, but I didn't hold back either. And no matter what I wrote, there wasn't a single thing they cut.
Wow.
So it was a nice start.
That's great. Punisher Born, which sort of is the Frank Castle sort of Vietnam War-based origin story. Obviously you have a really amazing history with war comics, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But I'm just curious about Punisher Born, if that was something you pitched to Marvel, they pitched to you, or...
As I recall, recall, there was a kind of a vibe for origin stories at that time. I think they did a Wolverine one.
Yeah, it was Wolverine Origin kind of started that off.
And it may have been coincidence, but I knew that I had to start it in Vietnam because that is intrinsic to the Punisher character. It's where he, simply put, it's where he gets a taste for it.
Yeah.
It's where something takes hold of him and needs an outlet. Whatever this something is, it certainly finds an answer within Frank. He embraces it, and when he comes back to the world, well, things take their natural course. So I knew I had to start in Vietnam, and I've always been fascinated with that particular conflict. So that worked out well. I may, in fact, still go back and do another Vietnam story with Frank Castle, possibly something to do with his first tour of duty, where he's simply an infantry officer as opposed to the kind of special forces malarkey that came later. Yeah, I don't think I'll ever stop being fascinated with that particular piece of history. It's such a witch's brew, a maelstrom. It's like everything went wrong at once and continued to do so for a good 10 years. It's an amazing piece of history.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons I mentioned is one of the things you sort of established in Punisher Born, that so many Punisher stories prior to your run on him had sort of been this guy's family was killed and it turned him into the Punisher, and that was the comic that sort of said this has always been there.
Yeah.
And Jason Aaron's run definitely expanded on that
Yeah.
as well. Now, up next, I would love to talk about The Boys.
Right.
Okay, so first off, The Boys started at Wildstorm. And we'll talk a little bit about that departure, but from the beginning, was this sort of, when you originally came to the project, they were sort of allowing you to do your take on superheroes, and they were fine with it from the beginning?
Yes, essentially that's the case. The Boys had a much more organic beginning than Preacher. It didn't have that add and subtract bits as you go aspect that I talked about. It wasn't fully formed, but pretty early on it was set as what it was going to be, with the 5 characters, the major events of the storyline, the ending. The ending to Preacher didn't occur to me until about the second year I was writing the book. The ending of The Boys was set in stone from the beginning. So were many scenes. Butcher's encounter with Jack from Jupiter involving the carving knife, that was one of the first things I thought up, because all I could think of are these people who say their magic word and turn into the character. I thought, well, just get him and then he's yours and then you can do whatever you want. And from that, I just began to imagine this guy, and Butcher's character was sort of slowly coming together, but I just thought this behemoth of a man with some wretched little half-formed superhero at his mercy, taking them to pieces with a carving knife, which is the most low-tech and unsuper piece of equipment you can imagine. And I thought that would be a pretty amazing kind of ironic contrast, as this guy who can, if he can say his word, fly through the air, level tall buildings and so on, was simply dismantled by an East End thug with a knife. So that, as an example, is one of the things that was there from the beginning.
Absolutely. So I remember picking up The Boys. I remember the hamster issue came out.
Right.
Which, for those who are not familiar, it was on the cover, right?
Yes.
There's this hamster that is
Wrapped in tape.
Yes. The hamster has had an adventure that maybe it didn't. It was an unexpected adventure.
It didn't want to be
Yeah.
there. The hamster, interestingly enough, it shares a little bit of its history with Annie January, the character Starlight, who's forced to commit an appalling act to get into the Justice League. In both cases, I was simply going to write those scenes, and then those characters would be kind of throwaway. But then I started to feel sorry for Annie.
Right.
And before I knew it, I was writing a scene where Huey's sitting in Central Park, and he's pissed off about something that Butcher's done. And then I thought, oh my goodness, what if she came walking down and that's where that began. Otherwise, I would have probably just heaped more and more degradation on top of her until she sort of disintegrated. And the same thing was true with Jamie the hamster. that was just going to be a one joke thing, and then I started to feel sorry for the hamster, and I thought it's not right. This is cruelty to animals, and really it would be kind of nice if Huey had a pet. Also, Huey is based on an old British newspaper strip character called Wally, who's just this kid who sits on a bucket, and he had a mouse called Jamie. And I just sort of thought, wait a minute, that hamster, if that was Jamie, then it could be, and that helped to bring that together as well. But in both cases, it was like, can't just do that to the hamster, can't just do that to the poor superheroine.
Right.
Yeah.
Was the hamster the straw that broke the camel's back at Wildstorm?
No.
Was it the hamster that broke the camel's back?
I don't know exactly what it was, in terms of pinpointing a scene. I think what it was, because they never told me precisely, and I was too busy not looking a gift horse in the mouth when they told me they were going to give me the thing back.
Right.
I just couldn't wait to get out the door, so I wasn't asking any questions. I think it was just the general notion that you can do a book like Preacher, and you can say awful things about the Lord God, but you can't do a book like The Boys and say awful things about Superman and Batman and the Justice League, because those are the characters that we make a fortune out of in merchandise, in movies,
Right.
T-shirts and so on. And it's, you're staining the brand here. You're
Right.
causing a real problem here. Given that the hamster incident was in issue 6, I'm pretty sure the damage was done a long time before that.
Okay.
So I can't really lay it at the feet of the hamster. Yeah.
Do you mind if I ask you, because I cannot think of many situations in which a company has relinquished the property to the creator. Was it on the strength of the sales that they thought, well, we can't just say, oh, we're canceling it because the sales are poor, or?
I think it was just, as I recall, Jim Lee played an active part. And I think there was just a general sense of, look, why annoy everyone? Why piss everyone off when no one's at fault here? Why not just give the boys their book and let them go? No harm done.
Right.
And it was just a remarkable piece of common sense that I think everyone did very well out of. There was no need for anyone to be vindictive, and there was no need for anyone to cause a huge fuss. Yes, it was a sort of a triumph of common sense in a way.
It's the most amicable comics parting of, and then Dynamite coming into the picture. Were you courted by several publishers, or was it an immediate sort of synchronicity with them?
Pretty much every publisher. There was a couple of weeks where, everyone gave us their pitch. I did a certain amount of research. Eventually went with Dynamite just because they weren't too big and they weren't too small. They weren't a sort of chaotic little operation where, they'd never have been able to keep the schedule organized. They weren't so big we'd get lost. There was no point in leaving DC, for instance, and going to Marvel and being, at the mercy of another set of corporate interests and tastes. Dynamite were just right, and I've never had cause to regret the decision.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things that you're famous for, and also so much of your work, in particular Battlefields, that I've loved, is your war comics. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Battlefields. Obviously, you've done earlier work that was war themed. Was it DC or Vertigo? I can't remember.
It was Vertigo.
Okay.
Yeah.
Obviously, historically, how much research have you done, and additionally, sort of how did you decide to start a new war series with Dynamite?
In terms of research, it's not so much research as stuff as I've just picked up from my reading anyway, because of my own fascination with military history. And really, anytime I get an opportunity to write that stuff, I take it. So when The Boys had taken off and it was doing very, very well for Dynamite, the publisher, Nicky Barrucci, said, whatever your next thing is, we'll take it. And I said, well, you may not feel that way in a second because it's World War II. And he was like, hey, we'll try it. And it's worked out well. Now the third series is just coming to an end. And that will be the last of Battlefields. But I'm very pleased to say that the old War Story series from Vertigo will be appearing from Avatar. DC have given me the rights back, lock, stock, and barrel, taking it over to Avatar, reprinting those 2 collections, and then there'll be a new series launched off the back of those. So it looks like I'll be writing World War II and war stories for quite some time to come.
Very cool. I want to talk about Avatar in a second. I had one quick sort of hybrid question about Battlefields. 2 of the stories in Battlefields, Night Witches, which is about the female Russian fighter pilots who are literally in the, I think I can say the shittiest planes, flying over the German lines at night.
Yeah.
And also Dear Billy, which is a story about a nurse, are really fascinating stories. And they're sort of built around these really complex female characters. I was just curious, were those particular sort of elements of history that you thought no one's been talking about this?
Well, in the case of the Night Witches is an interesting example because one of the reasons I like war comics so much is that I grew up on them. When I was a kid, there was a British anthology called Battle. In it was a strip called Johnny Red. Johnny Red was about a British fighter pilot flying with a Russian squadron, and that was where, aged 8, I first came across the Night Witches, because the writer of Johnny Red, Tom Tully, involved them in the Johnny Red storyline. In fact, there's a collection, the 3rd collection of that has just come out. It's called Angels Over Stalingrad, and it's about the initial involvement of the woman pilots in that particular battle. So that was where I first encountered the notion, and I know this is odd in a 21st century perspective, but in 1978 in Britain, finding out that girls flew planes, girls killed Germans, and the girls in the very first issue they show up in actually deck our hero, was quite shattering. And this is actually something about war comics that it's not quite unique. But you read this stuff and then you find out it's true. It would be, imagine if someone like Mark Waid, little kid, reads his superhero comics and then opens a book or switches on the TV and finds out they're real. Now, allowing for the enormous hyperbole, of course, that comes with fiction, that's what happened to me. I found out that all this stuff was based on reality. And in the specific instance of the Night Witches, that yes, there was several all-female squadrons in the Soviet Air Force. The Night Witches were the 588th Women's Night Bomber Regiment, and they flew these dreadful little biplanes on night interdiction. How much physical damage they did is still open to question, but the damage to German morale when they found out that they were being bombed and killed by women was enormous. That to me was particularly fascinating. But that to me is just one aspect of the great thing about war comics. It happened, it's true, it came from reality.
Cool. You have a really interesting partnership with Avatar Press. Avatar, if people aren't super familiar, I think it's okay to say a small independent publisher.
Yeah.
That to me is, if people sort of thought, oh, the boys in Preacher were pushing the envelope, Avatar to me has said, forget the envelope.
Yeah.
And you were able to do several series there, but one of them was called Crossed, which is insane. It is really crazy. But in the sense that I've read that you approached it in a way that when people are in zombie films, there are rules, and if they follow the rules, they're safe, and that this was almost something where it's like, that's not going to help you.
That was part of it. I should say that, by the way, I mean, you've identified Avatar as a place where, there is much dark, extreme work done by myself, by Warren Ellis, by Alan Moore. That's largely due to the publisher, William Christensen, whose own limits, if they exist, are far beyond my own, and from what I can tell, those of Warren and Alan too. But William's philosophy is very simple. He just doesn't censor you. You are free to write, and the artist is free to draw whatever you think is appropriate to tell the story. As for Crossed, I first started to think about sort of 2006. I was thinking about a lot of things. I was thinking about if I was going to do a horror book, I didn't want it to be easy to make friends with. I didn't want adorable fey vampires that teenagers could fantasize over. I didn't want, friendly, funny zombies. I didn't want, the werewolf that that you can treat like a pet. I didn't want any of these things where you could make the monster cuddly. And I also wanted to do a horror story that would really ultimately be about the people. It would be about people's reactions and people's means of survival and the things they would do to survive. And Crossed all came together about that time. It also came out of a kind of a grim feeling I had at the time. Second Bush term, Hurricane Katrina, a sense of government deserting the people, just casting them out into the storm and leaving them to fend for themselves. All that fed into Crossed. And as for the Crossed themselves, well, the monster, in effect, it's human evil. It's everything any person's ever done down the ages throughout history when they've been handed a license to behave towards other people in any way they choose. In other words, you can do anything you want. You're not committing a crime. This person is your plaything. Go. It's every instance of religious genocide, everything that's ever happened in a torture chamber, everything that happens in little African towns to this day. It's what happened in the Balkans in Eastern Europe during the 90s. It's every dreadful thing that people have ever done to other people. So in a way, human evil, people themselves are the monster. They're the villain.
Yeah, one of the things that I found so interesting about Crossed, and I'm going to try and keep this as spoiler-free as possible, but I feel like, especially in sort of horror movies and apocalyptic comics or novels, there's always this conceit that everyone is, there's a child, and the good of the child is what they have to take care of this child. You have a really strong female character who has a child. What's so interesting to me is it's one of the few stories I've ever read that allows her to be defined post that.
Right.
Does that make any sense, what I'm saying? I'm trying not to drop huge spoilers,
yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
It's a really interesting aspect of that book.
Yeah. One of the things I liked about writing Crossed was I wanted the lead character, the most, I was going to say the most important, perhaps the most self-sufficient, the most capable character. I wanted her to be a woman. This probably goes back to seeing Alien when I was 13, but I wanted her to be a woman, and I didn't want her to be an ex-Navy SEAL or to whip some sort of special forces training out of thin air, as you would normally have with a male character. I just wanted her to be a survivor, the kind of person who observes, thinks, and acts, and does it quietly, who's more likely to slip out the back door and let the idiots get killed. And I wanted the other lead character, the male character, to be someone who would not be a traditional alpha male, who again would not be an ex-Navy SEAL, and would have the good sense to realize that his only chance was to let this woman tell him what to do. And I think, to go back to your question, part of that was when I realized that Cindy was going to be like this, I didn't want her ultimately to be defined by her care for her kid. I mean, you think that's where it's going, but then of course there's that issue that we're trying not to give away. And I wanted after that Stan, who's very much not an alpha male, but to have his moment in the spotlight where he would help Cindy towards an understanding that perhaps she had kept him alive to allow to develop himself. So they helped each other in that way. I mean, you could say that the most shocking thing about Crossed, at least that first storyline, is the happy ending. Happy-ish.
Happy-ish.
Yeah.
Crossed, Preacher and the Boys are three comics. Well, let me back up this question a tiny bit. There's an era right now in comics where things are being optioned for feature films or TV left and right. Boys, The Preacher, and Crossed are all comics that are extremely edgy, that one might almost say, I don't know how they'd translate that to film. And yet, my understanding is that Preacher has been in development off and on for a couple years. Crossed, there's a screenplay that I believe you wrote. And The Boys, I know, has been bouncing around. Do you have any updates on the status of those and on how you feel about the fact that people are going to try and adapt them?
Preacher and the Boys continue to stumble along the path to whatever it is. Those two I file under believe it when you see it.
Right.
Crossed, William Christensen and I are now looking at actually shooting our own, I guess, webisodes you would call them. Short, snappy little sort of 6 to 8 minute self-contained stories. You should hopefully see an announcement about that in a couple of weeks. They have, people who follow Cross will know that Avatar have this annual promotion which they call Sea Day or Cross Day, when they move heaven and earth to shift the book as hard as they can, and you should see an announcement about this then in greater detail. That's also when I'm coming back to the ongoing book, which I'll continue to do on a yearly basis just to keep things ticking over.
Nice. Yeah. You have a new book called Red Team. If The Boys was sort of your take on the superhero genre, is Red Team your take on sort of the vigilante?
Yes, it's partly born of my love of crime drama, like The Wire and The Shield, of crime fiction, people like James Ellroy, Joe Lansdale, to an extent Stephen Hunter. Partly it's a look at what got me thinking was, what if someone really did try to be the Punisher? Well, if they tried to be the Punisher the way the Punisher is, I've always thought a realistic Punisher story is he lasts about a month and then either the cops get him or the mob get him, or he kills someone innocent and shoots himself out of angst. But what if someone actually tried to do what he does? And I thought, well, the people in the best position to do that, in terms of the intelligence they could gather, the means at their disposal, and perhaps also the motivation, would be cops, would be what you might think of as almost the special forces end of cops, the gang task forces, the special units. And I decided to sort of play with this idea and see how long these guys could keep it going and what the cost to them would be as a result. So I guess that's where Red Team comes from. It comes out of the Punisher, but it's kind of a rejection of the Punisher too. It's what would happen in the real world if somebody really tried it.
What else do you sort of have coming up in 2013?
Let's think. Battlefields is ending. The last Night Witches story is sort of running at the moment. There's Red Team, obviously. The Fury book is going to run to issue 13. There's this Crossed 4-parter. Beyond that, I've got quite a lot of stuff coming up. I see there'll be the new War series at Avatar, which will follow the Battlefields format, 3-issue stories in a kind of an ongoing series. And there's a sci-fi book, and there'll be another Crossed story about this time next year. I've just finished that, actually. That's called The Thin Red Line, and that's as close to an origin story on the Crossed as you're gonna get. And then there's another book that all I'll say is you'll know it when you see it.
Fair enough. We're going to open it up to questions. So I will start with you, since yours is the first hand I saw.
I'm a huge fan of Wormwood.
Wormwood at
I'm not
Avatar.
a spiritual man, but there's sometimes I turn the page and I laugh really hard and then look up to see if I'm going to be struck by anybody. What is your stance on spirituality, and how do you handle, probably, I'm assuming, overcoming the mass of negative responses you get to books such as that?
Answer to the first is pretty much hardcore atheist. More and more intransigent on that one with every passing day. And as for the response, shucks. As for the response, well, you know, I don't think there really is much of a negative response. I think at this point, with Preacher, with Wormwood, and so on, people know what to expect, and they've already made the decision whether or not to follow me down that particular path. So they know what they're going to get, so there really isn't much in the way of protest. You know, although that could change, all we have to do is end up with the book ending up under the wrong pastor's nose, and then we're doomed. But
Well, thank you. I love it.
also, you'll notice that you might keep looking up to see what if you're going to be struck down, but you haven't been. There's the clue.
Sometimes you laugh and you go, oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if I forget to look both ways when crossing the street after this, you'll know that I wasn't as clever as I thought I was.
You first, and then you.
Hi, Mr. Ennis.
Hi.
Looking at your Punisher work, the way I interpret how you wrote the Punisher, especially in the Max series, and correct me if I'm wrong, obviously, but you wrote him as kind of like almost a force of nature, in that he himself doesn't have any character arc. Like, he doesn't evolve from one point of the story to another. It's
Quite
the
right.
characters around him that do that evolution. Was that something that you were specifically trying to come up with when you were in Punisher?
Absolutely. You know, you're right to highlight the Max book. That's exactly one of the things I was going for. Apart from my own suspicions about the notions of character development, you know, a character must develop. People in real life, I find, tend not to. They get to a certain point, late 20s, early 30s, and they are who they are. And they might waver a bit, but they generally go back to who they are. But that's neither here nor there. No, Frank was supposed to be, as you say, a force of nature. He would be the one constant. He would represent the world that I felt I was beginning to detect after 9/11, this world of darkness, of black ops and special forces subterfuge, of maniacs being fought in the dark places of the world that the rest of us are lucky enough not to have to go to, of the abuse of power that some of the people who fight those wars sometimes fall prey to. Frank, I think on at least one occasion he told, there's a character in the book called McAllister, Catherine McAllister, I think her name is, or is it O'Brien? It's O'Brien. And she has a sort of on-off relationship with Frank. On at least one occasion he does say, you should get away from me. Because one way or another, if you're in this world, you will get killed, and it turns out he's right. Not many of the supporting cast in that book made it. And that was really a comment on Frank and of the world he represented, that it's like a cancer, it will claim you in the end.
Do you think that's why the movies kind of haven't gotten it right, in that the movies keep trying to have him develop as a character?
They keep trying to humanize him.
Yeah.
And that's a mistake. There should be no box of toys. There should be there should be no this was my little girl's doll. That shouldn't be there. He cut that out of himself and threw it away.
I saw there was someone over there. Yeah.
With your books and such, it goes into very dark places, and you were talking about with Cross how it's supposed to represent the kind of most negative in humanity and stuff, and it's really, really dark. So I was wondering, do you do anything to balance it out? Do you have anything that restores your faith in humanity?
Do you look at kitten photos, Garth? The question for the people watching online was just about how dark Crossed is and if you do anything to balance that out.
Within Crossed, I tend to focus more on the survivors. And in the first storyline, I don't want to give it away for anyone who hasn't seen it, but there is an ultimately happy ending. In the second one, not so much. The third one that's going to start in a couple of weeks, you'll see, is an odd sort of a beast, because for the first time it's about people who have decided to have a go back at the cross. Any notion of balancing their evil isn't really going to appear in the comic, unless you count the notion of the survivors themselves and their own attempts to hang on to their own humanity and to avoid becoming monsters themselves. Ultimately, the Crossed have no choice in what they are. The survivors, through their own decisions about what they'll do to survive, they do have choices, and that to me is the interesting aspect of the book, is how far you'll go to stay alive. And also, perhaps how you might take advantage of other people in a survival situation, how you might start to exhibit cross-type behavior of your own, if you're the kind of person who's perhaps a manipulator, someone who takes advantage of the weak. In a survival situation, that's obviously going to come up. So it's really an examination of that. It doesn't really focus on the lighter side.
Garth, I wish we could keep going. We're unfortunately out of time, but this has been awesome. Guys, thank you, and a big round of applause for Mr. Garth.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was really great.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your time. This is a big